This is episode 17 of the Everything History podcast, and joining us today is Professor Mark Hertzman, a lecturer in Latin American and Brazilian history.
I discharged my last duty as king and emperor.
This is Everything History.
Everything you hold worthwhile is at stake.
We meant more to kids than Jesus did, or religion at that time.
I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth.
Alright, what got you into history, and more specifically, what got you into Latin American, Brazilian history, culture, and that kind of discipline?
Well, I first became interested in history, like a lot of people, I think. I had a really amazing history teacher in middle school, in 8th grade, Mr. Quinn, and that was my first real kind of exposure, excitement to history, I'd say. Latin America and Brazil in particular, I grew up in New Mexico, and so I was always kind of interested in the, the intersection of the U.S. and Latin America that was happening where I lived. And then when I went to college, I majored in Spanish and history. I studied abroad in Chile, in South America. And while I was there, I traveled around a lot, and I went to Brazil and really fell in love with the place. I really wanted to learn Portuguese, and that's what led me indirectly and through other roads, I guess, to where I am now.
Yeah, I think that's a strong correlation with a lot of history majors, is they have one really good history teacher or someone who really inspires them to do that.
Yeah.
But what do you think it is, and let's try and be honest here, what do you think it is that a lot of people are turned off by history?
This is, I'm not sure if I would phrase it exactly like that, but we are thinking about this a lot in our department now. What would make history more appealing, more exciting to a lot of people? And I don't know. I think, I have some ideas because we actually did a very large survey of our students last year, as you know. Right. And even before that, I think we had a sense that it's really a combination of things, I guess. On the one hand, I think there are some, there's an idea out there that the liberal arts in general and the humanities and history may not be quite as useful for jobs. And I think that's a misnomer, but I think it's it's something that's sort of been ingrained. Mm-hmm. But I also think one of the things that came out in the surveys that was really interesting is that people who actually take history classes love them, and they realize that this is not, a lot of people had history classes before that weren't exciting. They weren't as fortunate as me to have a Mr. Quinn, and they think of history as something that's just the rote memorization of dates and, boring sort of regurgitation of things. And our history classes aren't like that. And so once students actually take history, I think they really like the courses. They like what they see, and they like what they hear, and they find it to be engaging and even useful. But part of it right now then is kind of a messaging aspect, I think.
Now, what would you do to encourage people to get more into history classes, like students here at the University of Illinois or elsewhere?
Yeah, well, so I guess it's on two levels. Here at Illinois, I'd say to talk to people like you, talk to people who are in the major, and talk to people who like classes, and just sort of get a sense. One of the great things about our department also is that we, our professors are really engaging and available. And so I'd encourage people just to reach out to me. I'm the Director of Undergraduate Studies right now, and, to other professors. And, outside, it's interesting. I don't know what the best way, and I'm not someone who thinks that history needs to be a part of everybody's life. Right. And so people outside of the department, I think, and like you said, elsewhere in the, in the country, I don't know, how to ask people to get engaged,
what would you say that a history major or something in the liberal arts akin to it, what do you think that offers students that perhaps other departments, other majors doesn't offer? Yeah,
it's a good question. So, I think there are a number of things. I mean, one is I really do think that we, we're not totally alone in this, but we are very at the cutting edge, I think, of teaching students how to write, and how to write well, and how to write, in a rigorous way. And, I know that you already suffered through one of my classes with the tons of rewrites. So one thing is and writing is sort of a skill that everybody needs, right? But it's not just, but that's, history isn't the only discipline that does that. I think that we really provide a way to understand the world, our surroundings, how to engage with different forces, different
and how to
things.
critically think on these things. I think that's what a lot of liberal arts majors really learn how to do. Not just translate their ideas into arguments and persuasive papers or narratives,
Right.
but they learn how to really think out problems and really analyze what evidence they have and come to an actual conclusion. And that's actually a skill that a lot of majors really don't acquire, but history majors it's like honed into that you're supposed to find the evidence, find what you're looking for, and get your message out in the best way possible. So I think it, like the writing skills are, paramount in this world. You really need to learn how to write to people and talk to people and translate your ideas to someone else, but you also need to be able to translate other people's ideas from the past. And I think history majors really learn how to do that.
Yeah, thanks. No, that's a great way of putting it, actually. That's really good. And I think you're absolutely right because, it's hard for me to imagine a job that a college graduate would get where they wouldn't need precisely those skills. And even more specifically, there are very few jobs that don't require some kind of research, right? Not necessarily research into the past, but some kind of research that would then need to be transformed exactly in the way that you just mentioned, right? Into something understandable, and something carefully weighed and considered and applied to some sort of argument.
Right, and applying that same kind of research, those methods, how do you think studying Hispanic culture, Brazilian culture, and their history, how do you think that's different? That kind of research is different from other historical methodologies.
Right. Yeah, that's a fantastic question too. And this is something that, I try and address whenever I start a class on Latin American history. And I guess there's a few things, that come to mind. I mean, first, as a U.S. citizen, or just as someone living in the U.S. in the 21st century, it's kind of impossible not to be aware of the importance of Latino culture and, and of Latin America in that sense as part of the United States, right? That we are increasingly
relation to the United States. Yeah.
Absolutely, and the number of people in the United States now that's always growing that are either from Latin America or whose parents, right, or grandparents. So, so part of it is we learn more about ourselves and our country by studying Latin America. I think there's something that beyond that is not necessarily unique just to Latin America, but that's probably unique to places outside of the so-called Western world, right? That there's something I think really important and crucial and beneficial from studying while you're in college or being exposed to cultures, ideas, and histories that you might not have gotten so much growing up, right? Because part of, I think, the great value and one of the greatest challenges of being in college is this sort of personal growth that, that not everybody goes through, but everybody confronts in one way or another. And so I remember for me, it was a big decision to go to either Spain or Chile for study abroad. And ultimately I went to Chile because... What made you make that choice? Yeah, I mean, one thing was the programs that I sort of knew about in Spain were already at that point, and I think they're even more so now, probably famous for, it's basically just kids from the U.S. that go there and take advantage of the, drinking age being low, and that and they're all just hang out with folks from the U.S. Okay. And of course, you have that aspect in any kind of study abroad, but I really wanted to go to somewhere that I felt would be very just different, maybe even disorienting in a good way. Yeah. And that's sort of what led me to go to a place in a continent I'd never been to. Did going to Chile change your outlook on how you wanted to go into further education or anything like that? Yeah, it did. And I guess it's hard to really quantify exactly how, because I remember I was a junior when I went there and I was coming back for my senior year and I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life. And I actually, had a little bit of an episphany when I was in South America, and I don't know exactly why, but some of it was just the distance, from being away from what was familiar. So I don't know exactly what it was down there, but I do know that being away from a comfort zone and sort of what I was used to really made me think about my life in a different way and sort of what I wanted to do. Yeah, it was good for you. It was good for me. It was definitely good for me. It was hard a lot of times. It was a very hard year in many ways, but it was good for me. All right. What was going off of your experience there and just in education in general, what was an historical assignment, homework, essay, speech, something like that you really went above and beyond with? Yeah, so there were two things that actually, I've been thinking about this, that go back to that class in 8th grade with Mr. Quinn. Right. So the first was, we had on the wall, in the classroom, all the presidents, right, in the history of the United States. And Mr. Quinn said that if we memorized all of them in order, we'd get, whoever could would get extra credit. And I think I was the only one who tried it, and I got it. And that was just sort of like an achievement for me. It was like, I could not do it now. I will tell you that. That's for sure. But I did it then. But then kind of more substantively, we had to do a research paper on anything that we wanted to, or any historical figure. And
this is 8th grade?
8th grade.
Okay.
Yeah. And so my mother, her library in her office had an amazing collection of books from my grandparents, who I was very close with and who had passed away by that point. And there was this book. There were a couple books by this guy named Malcolm X that I kept seeing on the shelf. Right. And I wanted to know, what's the deal? Why is his last name X, and what is the deal here? And so one day she let me look at one of the books, Malcolm X Speaks. It's this famous collection of his speeches. And this was around the same time that the assignment was coming out. So they said that, my teacher said I could do that, as my project. And it ended up being, it was, like I never put myself into an assignment or a school project like this, but I ended up writing something insane for an 8th grader. Like, it was like, like 25 pages or something that I read his autobiography, and it changed the way I thought about myself, as at the time, like teenager growing up in New Mexico, but in America. And, it really sort of like changed the way I looked at the world, and really got me passionate about exploring someone's past.
Yeah, definitely. I think I had one of those experiences too. Mine was probably, sophomore year in high school.
Yeah.
Basically, one of my hallmark teachers, Mr. Davis, history teacher, of course, got me really inspired to do history. And we had a Civil War project because we went slowly throughout the year. We were supposed to get all the way to World War I, but we were we were just at the Civil War by the time the class was over.
Yeah.
And we had just an open-ended project. You could do basically as little or as more as you wanted to do.
Right.
And I basically did, and usually it was a group project, but I decided to do mine by myself, and just to create because I was kind of obsessed with William Tecumseh Sherman, just on his personality and what he did. And I ended up writing a weird sort of personal journal made up narrative along with historical evidence. So this is historical fiction. I made up a character that was going through Sherman's March to the Sea along with all these real historical characters, and it ended up being a weird 40 to 45 page paper. Yeah. That didn't really make that much sense, but I just poured every thought I had into it.
Yeah, you pour yourself into it. It's really amazing. I mean, that, that moment when I think a lot of people actually don't ever have that, but when you really get so excited about something you're doing in school, that you pour yourself into it that much, it's really amazing. And, so mine was in history too. And I, as you were saying that, I had a few in high school actually in an English class, but I got to write, I was really passionate about sports, and I got to write a paper about Muhammad Ali, and then, and about the Black Sox, the Chicago White Sox scandal.
1917, 18.
19, yeah. And, so it's really wonderful when that happens. It's really amazing.
Yeah, and let's see. A few years back, you published a book called Making Samba, A New History of Race and Music in Brazil. Mm-hmm. So tell us a little bit what samba exactly is. Okay,
sure. So it's funny, actually, because when I went to do research as a graduate student, I thought samba was just one thing, one single musical genre like jazz, or I did not have much of a sophisticated idea of it. And everybody I met in Brazil, older musicians in particular, mm-hmm. when I would start to interview them, the first question they would ask me would be, well, what kind of samba are you talking about? And so and I guess the same thing could happen with someone doing a project about jazz or anything else, definitely. Right? So there's tons of different genres, but mainly what samba is associated with today is carnival. So you've probably, and I'm sure a lot of your listeners have heard, have seen these massive carnival celebrations, definitely. Right? And these amazing drums and, different rhythmic lines. So that is one kind of carnival samba. The stuff that I was really interested in comes from way further back. So, really anywhere from mainly the 1920s and 30s is what's understood to be samba's golden age. And it's a musical rhythm that, is unique to Brazil. That shares a lot in common, though, with other genres through the Americas, and actually has a lot of interesting sort of historical myths and aspects in common with jazz and others, other musics associated with the African diaspora.
Yeah, and how important do you think samba is to the Brazilian culture?
Well, this is a little bit of a contested and complex question, but most people would say that it's absolutely central. That, I'm sure you, again, and a lot of your listeners, when you've read things about, so during the World Cup and that kind of thing, when you read about Brazil in the English language press, samba is often a metaphor, right, for the entire country. So they'll say things like the Samba Boys have been playing, to refer to Brazilian soccer players. So it's held up as sort of like this metaphor that stands for all of Brazil. And of course, there are a lot of people, especially now, who musically don't think samba represents what Brazil is, right? And in other ways, culturally, racially, etc. So kind of a mixed bag there in terms of some, in some instances it stands for everything Brazilian, and in many more it stands for just a very small piece. So
you'd say samba is a little bit contested in like how it's perceived in Brazil? Yeah,
there's a number of contestations, and this is sort of so, and again, in some ways we have a good way of thinking about this through jazz. So, the origins of jazz and who invented jazz and where does this come from? Like, who owns jazz? Samba has very similar contestations all the way down to the intellectual property rights surrounding the supposed, it's not actually, but a song known as being the first samba. Okay. And so there's really, so when you talk about Jelly Roll Morton and stuff that was going on.
What is that first? "Quote unquote"
samba. So it's called Pelo Telefone, which in Portuguese means on the phone, and it was a song that was and really you'll see the timeline being very, very similar to jazz. In 1917, it became the Carnival hit, and almost immediately though there was basically a scandal over who was getting credit for creating the song, and people who felt like, wait a minute, I helped write this song and I'm not getting any money for it. I'm not getting any fame, etc. So from the very beginning, there was a contestation of who owns it in a really literal sense. But then it wasn't, and that, this is how musical genres work often, is that this song was sort of almost by happenstance called a samba. The actual musical genre that came to really consolidate around the word, that wasn't created for another 10 years or so until the late 20s and then into the 30s and 40s.
What do you think made samba, so you'd say in the 20s and 30s, that's when it started to become popular and like define its image?
Yeah, I mean,
what do you think made it like come into its form?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, this is one of those in some ways unanswerable questions of how does music, become what it is. But I guess we can point to a couple of things. One, and to bear in mind again that the word samba music called samba before the word samba before the music samba became popular, if that makes sense. But, let's think of a few different things. I mean, one was that this is the age when, especially in Latin America, a lot of nations are sort of starting to galvanize around an idea of having one musical form be associated with like, oh, this is what makes our country unique, and through that a metaphor for what racially makes us unique, right? So just like tango or tango in Argentina, son and other things in Cuba, right? This is part of sort of a larger global phenomenon. And then also though, and this is really part of how I write history, is it really is the individuals, these musicians, entrepreneurs who, so for example, in the late 1920s, the actual music that becomes samba, this was pioneered by a certain set of individuals in a specific neighborhood in Rio, and they were musical geniuses, and through sort of their musical, machinations, as well as their ability to market and, get connected to things, samba became what it became. So in some ways, sort of perfect storm in a lot of ways, I'd say.
Right. Did that group have a name from this specific area in Rio?
Yeah, well, so the sound itself is called the Astacio sound, and Astacio is the name of the neighborhood. So, but it wasn't a specific, when I say group, it wasn't like, it wasn't like a specific musical group, but it was a group of individuals who lived there. Mainly, Brazilians, black Brazilians, not all, but mainly Brazilians of African descent, and living in the same area, but also in constant conversation with folks from elsewhere in the city, people playing music around the world, right? So,
right. Yeah, and you mentioned like these Black Brazilians, these African Brazilians, but that means something a little bit different compared to the United States. How do you think? What I mean is, in the United States, there's a clear color line generally throughout our history between white and others, especially in accordance with the law. But Brazil, it's a little bit more ambiguous and a little bit different. Like, how do you think race is perceived differently in Brazil?
So this is one of those questions that's been debated and thought about for many, many years, right? And in some ways doesn't have a satisfying answer in my mind, but you're very right that and can be misleading even in sort of juxtaposing, but you're very right that what's constantly said and what is true is that in the United States we have historically a one drop rule, right? Where if you have, legally, if you have one drop of Black blood in your family lineage, you are identified as Black. And in Brazil, not only do you not have that, but you have a tendency towards, at least on the surface, acceptance of, well, anybody can be white, right? Which at the same time reinforces whiteness and sort of makes it the ideal, but allows for, again, at least theoretically, racial mobility, right? And part of what my book explains and looks at are the really clear limits of that racial mobility.
Right.
That, beyond this idea of, it's often said now that Brazil's a racial democracy, or it was for a while said that Brazil is a racial democracy. And there is, of course, a lot of much myth in all of that. So race is at once more fluid in Brazil than the United States, and in some ways more rigid too.
So you mentioned a lot of things that are kind of hard to like really describe. Like you mentioned, yeah. like you'd say the race is like geared towards, like it's geared towards more whiteness. Like if they were on a census and they were people that are of Brazilian descent, how would they like describe themselves on a Brazilian census compared to like the United States census?
Yeah. Well, so of course it would depend on the individual, right? But one of the things that's really interesting in Brazil is that you can, not only can you identify yourself, but you can also describe yourself. And so there's Brazil famously has hundreds, if not thousands, of racial categories, which again is a great, distinction probably from the United States. But now on the census, there's been a phenomenon of people describing themselves in very elaborate terms, so that, I may be a person of African descent and the color of my skin is like cinnamon, honey, and these are things, mm-hmm. These would actually become the official census. This is my description of myself. And so on the one hand, there's a lot more sort of flexibility and even an ability to self-identify. And on the other hand, you still do absolutely have sort of an emphasis on whiteness, both in terms of what you see on TV, who our politicians are, et cetera. And then in terms of more sort of everyday life, who gets jobs, who doesn't, that would resemble the United States in a really, very closely. So
why do you think there is so many of these racial categories in Brazil? This like weird diaspora of like people typifying themselves in so many different ways.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's, a huge, complex, very difficult question. But also, one of the greatest questions of history, which is why, for, I guess, a number of reasons, Brazil and white Brazilians never did sort of identify or feel the need to identify and create a very rigid Jim Crow-like one drop rule kind of system that we have in the United States.
So you'd say maybe it isn't like a real rigid system because no one really like made through law that you had to be like it had to be rigid, or like there wasn't an elite control for a long time?
Well, it's not that there wasn't elite control, but it's hard, and it's really, this is another really great question. It's really chicken or egg though, right? That like right. Whether the law created this or the law was the result of, something. And clearly in both societies, in the U.S. and in Brazil, there was a very similar, both nations were built on slavery, and Brazil, in fact, is one of the big conundrums and sort of paradoxes, is that while Brazil has all this flexibility, Brazil didn't abolished slavery for almost 25 years after the United States. It was the last country in the Western Hemisphere.
Yeah, 1888.
Exactly, 1888. And so you have this kind of one argument that I find very compelling and about that is that in the United States you have what some historians call a strong argument made in favor of slavery in the United States, where we believe morally in the institution, right? And this is made
in the institution of slavery.
Exactly. And so this is made by very prominent people, right? Politicians throughout the South. It's not the only argument, but it is an argument that's made. And in Brazil, there really was almost an absolute absence, especially in the last 30 or 40 years of slavery. This is not the way people are holding on to slavery. They're not saying, we believe in this institution. To the contrary, they are saying, we really wish we could get away. We really wish we could do away with this institution, and we really want to, and it has nothing to do with race even, but our economy is so tied to it, it would destroy everything. And so you have this situation where all the way into the late 1880s, within almost a decade of the 20th century, you have planters in Brazil saying, oh, well, we really wish we could free you. We really wish we could create, an equal society, but we just can't. We're sorry. And so
they can't economically do it. That's what they're arguing.
That's their argument, right? And so in the U.S., then, if you have a situation where ultimately, and clearly, in the U.S., you also have the economic argument, right? But you also have regional differentiation that's very different than in Brazil.
Like sectionalism and whatnot.
Yeah, exactly. And whole sort of, of course you have regional differences in Brazil, but they just don't map exactly in the same ways in the U.S. But in the U.S., if you have, and we see this rearing its head in very powerful and often ugly ways today about, what life means to Southerners and, what the war of, Civil War meant, or in some people's lexicon, the war of Northern aggression, right? In Brazil, you don't have a civil war over slavery. And you also don't even have people who are publicly at least claiming that they are going to die. We don't have very many people saying we are going to die to preserve this way of life, right? You actually have people saying, no, we want to do away with it too. And so, in some ways, the irony of that is you have something that's more discursively or rhetorically, soft that actually endures for much longer because you have 25 extra years of slavery.
Right. And what do you think slavery's connection in Brazil is to how it views race now?
Yeah. That in a lot of ways I would feel like is very similar to the United States, that you have undeniable and very clear sort of legacies of slavery to this day, right? And clearly slavery set and helped set so many templates in terms of, how each society understands itself and understands different people's roles within it, right? And you also have sometimes this debate. You have similar debates in Brazil and in the U.S., or similar arguments that people resort to, which is when someone is going to talk about racism and is going to talk about it as being one legacy of slavery, you have in Brazil, as you do here, people saying, well, come on, it's like, even in Brazil, it's over 100 years ago, this does not matter anymore, right? So in that ways, again, you see very different trajectories in the U.S., but then you see the U.S. and Brazil really lining up in interesting and, again, sometimes upsetting ways.
Like in how there's legacies of slavery in both cultures that are like analogous to each other?
So, yeah, absolutely. That, in the same way that, in the same way that poverty and class and race kind of map themselves.
Like where certain people ended up living and.
Exactly. And just in general having a society that is sort of based on the subjugation and enslavement of one group of people, and not much of an acknowledgement that when you try and really acknowledge that, or if you would talk about reparations or anything like that, that's not going to be, neither country has
not going to really talk about it.
Yeah. Although in Brazil, interestingly enough, there are some movements that are very interesting that are happening towards that.
Recent?
Recent. But sort of unsure what's going to happen. But there are ways that people are claiming kind of their descendants, not as much from slaves, because there was no system of reparations in Brazil even less so, so in the U.S., when at least you have this promise of 40 acres and a mule that doesn't, realize itself. That fell through. Yeah. In Brazil, the reparations are actually for the slave owners. So and so this rhetoric of economic loss is like very powerful in Brazil. And so the people who are losing their slaves, quote unquote, losing their slaves, they're the ones who may get reparations. But now you have a lot of really powerful movements, very contested movements too, to claim land by people who show that they were descendants of runaway slave communities. So this is people who were outside of the slave, the institution of slavery before it ended. And again, lots of contestations over it, but that's something that's very remarkable that, is not happening in the U.S.
Right. And what do you think this is another fairly large question, but what do you think some of the legacies of Brazilian slavery are in their culture today?
Yeah. So, so sort of in addition to, because the main ones are like, systemic, like inequality and, and embedded stereotypes.
Like, do you think there's like clear economical differences in like certain groups of people, or the way certain cities developed in the 20th century and whatnot? Anything like that? Yeah,
absolutely. I think that, I guess you have to be careful not to, you can make too structuralist of an approach. And in fact, one of the first major arguments in Brazil along these lines, so in the 1960s, there was this social scientist who kind of, for the first time within the academy, really shattered the idea that Brazil was a racial democracy. And he did this by showing real systemic inequality from slavery in Sao Paulo, up to, recent times. But what he did also was sort of paint Afro-Brazilians, African Brazilians, and, slaves and their descendants as sort of helpless against all of these larger forces. And this is something that a lot of people in the United States did too. And so
they can't really move against it economically.
Exactly. That like slavery put them so far back and destroyed any sort of, anomie is sort of the social science term from the 60s that was used in Brazil and the United States, that it put them in a state of anomie, which is like isolation and backwardness so far that they could never do any, they were never, no black person would even want to be a capitalist is sort of the terms that it was put in. And that of course is a very flimsy and, and troubling argument. That being said, I think there's, it's very easy to see, that to become a full citizen, to become someone who is capable and had the access to the same opportunities and sort of fruits of labor that most white immigrants, not all, but most white immigrants in Brazil, not to mention folks whose families had been there for a while, had, just like in the United States, I think that is very clear. And I think, and then I think on another sort of what you might call harder to see obviously level, or a level that might be harder to see obviously, are sort of the stereotypes and assumptions about what black skin denotes and what white skin denotes.
Yeah, what that means.
Exactly. And in terms of intelligence, in terms of wealth, in terms of property holding. And in that, again, I think that we see very similar, at least comparable legacies in the U.S. and Brazil.
Right. And you mentioned just there, Afro-Brazilians, and earlier you mentioned the African diaspora. What exactly is the African diaspora?
That's a fantastic question. That's like, and a question that so many people would have so many different answers to. But, in just very general, simple terms, it is people of African descent and their culture, their life, their institutions and in this case, in the Americas, right? And so that they trace themselves back to not a single place in this instance, but a larger, massive, internally complex, and diverse continent.
So, like, what would be the time frame on the African diaspora? When is this directly related to like slavery coming out of Africa? Right.
When people talk about the African diaspora, especially in the Americas, you would definitely date it to the turn of the of the 16th century. Although because of Portuguese slaveholding in Portugal and in the Portuguese Sea Islands, this goes back even before 1492. But yeah, you would think of it as sort of the Atlantic slave trade. That is like the moment of dispersal, violent dispersal and diaspora.
Right. And how is the African diaspora different like, how did it influence Brazil differently and that
Mhm.
continent in general than it did North America, for instance?
Right. And this, I mean, this again is like, countless books have been written about very small pieces of that question. Right. And so, it really depends on where in Africa the person or group of people is coming from, where they ended up, under what circumstances they left and ended up, right?
Well, let's talk about, like, general numbers. Like, how many people went into, like, how many slaves were placed in North America, and how many slaves were,
Right. So this is a great question, and this is actually, and I'm not trying to stump you, but I would just have, do you have any sense of what would your guess be in terms of percentages, North America versus
I think I've heard
Caribbean?
this before, but I don't want to go overboard, but I'm going to guess around 300 to 500,000 in North America, slaves. That could be wrong. And in Brazil, I'm pretty sure it was well in the millions.
That's there's correct and incorrect in that the general, the number that people are placing, that there's lots of disagreements, and this, as you can imagine, is kind of incredibly difficult.
It's probably hard to track down.
Historical demographics with something like slavery, it's just extremely difficult. But more or less, people agree on, I think, between 10 and 12 million Africans were taken to the Americas as slaves, and so many more to the U.S. than 300,000. But in terms of the percentages, you're right that this is somewhat remarkable. That I think, in general, the way people break it down is that there were about 20% of the 10 to 12 million would be to the United States, 10 to 20%.
Okay.
40% to the Caribbean, 40% to Brazil, and then probably the 10 to 20 extra in the rest of Spanish America.
Right, and that's a massive number compared to, like, a lot of, what we hear about, like, the Americas and whatnot. Why did Brazil, like, need so many slaves? Why did was that the Portuguese Empire?
It was the Portuguese Empire. I mean, there were a few other European powers there too, but yes, this was the Portuguese, not the Spanish. And, for a couple of reasons. I mean, one thing that happened there is that they're developing the most sort of labor-intensive sugar plantations, gold mines later, and then eventually coffee. These are, economies that need massive amounts of human power. And there is not, whereas in much of Spanish America, Native people are going to be sort of thrust into that role for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
In Brazil, that happens, but for a shorter period of time. And sort of on the coasts, there's not going to be, after the Portuguese have arrived for a while, there aren't going to be great numbers of Native people to enslave, or who can be enslaved, and so you have these really intense economic institutions that demand never-ending, almost kind of bottomless supply of people. And so you develop this really horrendous economic logic where it becomes financially more viable for a plantation owner in Brazil to just figure that they're going to import a slave, and this slave is going to work for about 3 to 5 years is probably going to be the life expectancy. And rather than provide what it needs to keep this person alive, they're just going to work the hell out of them,
right, yeah.
And, for 3 to 5 years, and then bring someone else in. And so
they basically work them to death?
Exactly. And that happens, in Brazil, and also especially in the Caribbean, in the, sugar islands, which of course are much smaller places, but are still like the same kind of dynamic with just, and there's different, I don't think historians sort of come to an agreement on this. The United States is it's unique in that this is the one kind of slave, institution of slavery where slave populations reproduce themselves, right? And there was not. Yeah. So, but in Brazil, that did not happen to nearly the same extent.
When was the slave trade, if ever, banned into Brazil?
Right. Well, so it was banned by the British in the very early 19th century, but Brazil kept it going until 1850. And so they're still importing slaves. And then after that, you have an interesting, and this, of course, this did happen in the U.S., but not on the same, this would happen within the South. But after 1850, and as slavery is starting to be gradually phased out in Brazil, you have groups in the north. So the Northeast, which was sort of the sugar capital, this is where all the slaves were. And then as sugar falls and coffee rises, you have an internal slave trade.
Like the prices of sugar.
Exactly. So sugar prices fall in a little market, and then you also have other, you have other competitors. And Brazil then, as it declines as a sugar power, it rises first as like a gold and diamond power, but then especially into the second half of the 19th century as a coffee power. And coffee's grown in southern Brazil. Sugar is grown in northern Brazil. And so you have all these plantation owners in the north that then sell their slaves to the south. So even after the external trade is actually
internal
done,
trade within Brazil?
Yeah, exactly. For about the last 30 to 40 years, especially.
So what caused in those last 25 years or so after 1850, what caused the Brazilian culture to lean towards doing away with slavery?
Yeah. Again, a number of complex issues, but, and this is something where, this is one of the most exciting things about history, I think, where as historians develop different ways of looking at the past, we develop different answers. And so it used to be that Brazil has sort of a Lincoln-like figure, Princess Isabel, who, issued what's called the Golden Law in 1888. And so she signed, piece of paper that said slaves are free. And so you've had for a long time this idea of kind of a top-down process where, princess and then other, and slave owners, they're the ones who engineered it.
Okay.
But within the last probably 30 years or so, historians have taken a much more complex and sort of inclusive view that shows that actually slaves played a major role in securing their own.
So possibly bottom up, like...
Exactly. Right. A bottom up process that now I think is becoming even more interesting and holistic, which is, we don't look just in terms of top down, bottom up, but you have really complex and difficult stories. Like I know there's one very famous historian in Brazil who right now is working on a project of slaves who own slaves. So this is not just former slaves who own slaves, which is a well-known phenomenon across the Americas, but this is actually slaves while they were slaves, were given their own slaves.
Right.
And so this sort of complex, set of hierarchies within slavery and then within the different degrees of freedom outside of slavery make the idea of top down and bottom up sometimes useless, right? Because who's, basically because if you just take this hypothetical slave who owns slaves, clearly he, and in this case, the ones he's working with are as a slave, whatever he's doing could be understood as sort of a bottom up kind of, action. And on the other hand, he has his own top down relationships with the people he owns. So, and then once you get outside of slavery, and you have people who are free to different degrees, right? And things get very messy.
Yeah, and you mentioned male slaves there. Is there strong, what I'm getting at is are owners abusing their relationship with slaves in Brazil?
Yes.
Like in the same way that Southern...
Yes, absolutely. The one, and like in the U.S., you have, ironically, painfully coming out of that, you have sort of the image of, this sort of benevolent, the whole idea of what people came to think of as racial democracy came from the historical myth that, on the slave plantation, slave women, took care of white male babies, and often, the way it was described often was they became their first sexual encounter, and that this gave rise to a very unique, sort of society.
Right.
So there's this really sort of perverse idea that, on the plantation, actually the relationship between black women and white men was kind of benevolent, and this, led to a really nice sort of relationship, overall, which hides obviously a much more complex and difficult reality.
Which, would you call it almost like a mythical story about it, or? Yeah,
absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely. And I guess the difference between the U.S. and Brazil is that where there's, we hear all kinds of things like Thomas Jefferson and all these stories, right? But you don't have from that mythical history the idea of that's the genesis of our nation. So in Brazil, though, you really have the idea that our nation is born from this, that like we have, to a certain extent, we have, black mothers and white fathers, and which is itself, that story is imbued with a very clear paternalism, and sexism. But you can see that it takes a little bit of a different shape. That, the Thomas Jefferson story is like, this is like, we have to hide this forever because we don't talk about it. Like, and if those children, they are not thought of as representative of our nation. They're actually thought of as like sort of the outliers, right?
So do we have documentation from these plantations or otherwise in Brazil that show the relationship between the fathers and their intermingling, like children?
Their children. Documentation with this,
like, do they recognize them? Or?
In a lot of, I mean, documentation is of course sparse with this kind of stuff too, but in some we do have a remarkable number of situations where we have either have wills, for example, where they will leave things to their children. Mm-hmm. And we also have on the other side, people have done really interesting work with court cases, which is remarkable, where women will actually sue. There's a book called Caetana Says No, and she, it's around this court case where she refused what her master wanted her to do sexually in terms of marrying someone and this kind of stuff. So we do have very interesting documentation, that shows different aspects of this. But you're very right that, in a lot of cases, there was also a complex system of godparentage. So, right. This played out in a lot of different ways.
Going further into the slavery question and mm-hmm. Brazilian slavery, how did that influence? This is another big one, but narrow it down as you see fit. Mm-hmm. How did it influence gender roles and whatnot in 20th century, 21st century Brazil, like after slavery dissipated?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's hard to, some of what we want to just, boil down is sort of defies that boiling right. down. But I think we have, a little bit of a continuation of what we were just talking about, which is you have this idea that, that the real kind of like the Black contribution to Brazil, if we're going to divide it on gender lines, it's going to be sort of as this, this mother, right, figure, and then, or as maybe this kind of like brute laborer male, right? And so just in terms of what space opens up for either group, you can see some clear limitations. I mean, neither is going to be sort of allowed or expected to own things, right? Neither is going to be allowed or expected to be intellectual powerhouses, right? No matter what lens you look through, when the larger prism is slavery, right? It's gonna set
those people back.
Well, it's gonna set, I think, stereotypes about those people back. Yeah, so definitely. Because one of the really famous moments, Fernando Henrique Cardoso, who was a president of Brazil before Lula, so at the turn of the 21st century, he made this infamous comment about having a foot in the kitchen, which was supposed to be this light kind of jocular reference to some connection to Afro-Brazilian female, heritage, that like that is where our Black heritage comes from. That's where my Black heritage comes from. And so, so very clearly, in that you really can draw when things resist sort of boiling down. Well, there actually you have a very straight, simple line. Like it's traveled different routes, but like the stereotype is very similar 100 years later or more.
Absolutely. And when studying Brazilian history, whatever it may be, what type of research methodologies do you go into? Say you're studying samba music. Mm-hmm. Who do you look for? You spoke of interviews with individuals that were involved with the samba movement. Yeah. But do you look for personal accounts like that, journals, music? How do you go about studying something like that? Right.
Well, so my approach is that I treat musicians kind of the same way that other historians treat laborers or soldiers or anything. And I look for, any kind of historical documentation, whatever it may be, right? So in that sense, I try not to be unique at all, that I try and just do what other people do. And on the other hand, of course, there are, when we're talking about which groups, sort of history has preserved written documentation about, we have a real disparity. And in Brazil, you have some really fantastic archives, and then also you have the combination of tropical heat and and the fact that there wasn't a printing press in Brazil before, really before like the 19th century, because of the imperial laws. You actually have sometimes to go really creative and have to be very different. So we have a student who's trying to do a history of slaves in Rio de Janeiro during the second half of the 18th century, before there's, really any kind of written, any newspapers and stuff like that. And it's very challenging. I mean, he's
hard detective work. Yeah.
It's very hard detective work. Yeah. And so the main thing is you just have to be very creative and very patient.
All right, we'll wrap up this episode with a story. Do you have a story for us?
Sure. I have it's less of a story than a larger dynamic, but that I think is a good way to wrap this up. So a book just came out by a really excellent historian, Peter Beatty, who's at Michigan State, and it's called Punishment in Paradise. And it takes the story of a penal colony, that was...
What is that, by the way?
A prison colony. Okay. So like a prison that was created on this really idyllic island. So kind of like Alcatraz, but like a combination of Hawaii and Alcatraz or something like that. And he uses that to address a larger story and a larger question in Brazilian history. And that is a great paradox that people have never fully understood was, how is it that Brazil was the last country in the Western Hemisphere, the last independent country in the Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery, but one of the first countries in the world to abolish the death penalty? And so he uses this prison colony to make, to really try and pull apart that question, and ultimately says that these two things are very related, that, in fact, to make Brazil, a country that would be acceptably liberal in the parlance of the time, right? Late 19th century. One of the things it did to counterbalance, well, we're going to keep slavery, we're keeping it going after everyone else, and people look at us as really retrograde and, as barbaric and like behind, we're not capitalists. What are we? We're going to do something very progressive and do away with the death penalty before almost anyone else. And so this is, this is not necessarily the story of one single person, but it is a very interesting story, and a good read, for anyone who wants to look into this stuff further.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you for joining us.
All right. Thank you. It's a pleasure.
All right. Thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, make sure to subscribe on iTunes, and a big thank you to Professor Hertzman for joining us. And if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, make sure to email me at everythinghistorypodcast@gmail.com. And make sure to come back next time as we continue the story of the French Revolution.
Thank you very much.